A new report from Canada's Auditor General has flagged serious issues in the development of the app. It highlighted government agencies repeatedly failed to follow good management practices in the contracting, development, and implementation of the app. There was a lack of testing for app updates, which at one point resulted in 10,000 travelers being wrongly instructed to quarantine. And the total cost of the app is impossible to determine because of poor financial record keeping. The ArriveCan app was launched in April 2020 as a way to manage travel and quarantine during the COVID-19 pandemic. But critics said the app was confusing and frustrating, and according to the Auditor General, that confusion cost millions of dollars. Karen Hogan is the Auditor General, and she joins me now. Ms. Hogan, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Your report is filled with criticism about the way this app was managed and how the contracts were awarded. You may not be able to answer this because of the deficiencies in the actual record keeping that you highlighted, but where exactly did this situation go so wrong?
I would tell you that what we found is that the confusion started early on at the start of the pandemic when the Canada Border Services Agency and the Public Health Agency of Canada didn't set out an agreement between the two of them to know who would be responsible for the development and the implementation of the ArriveCan application. And in that sort of accountability void, neither party put into place what I would say are sort of fundamental best practices when it comes to project management. So things as simple as an objective and goal for a project and then having a budget. It's really difficult to manage to a budget when you don't have a budget. And so that would have been the start of it. And then this disregard for some of the most basic elements when it comes to procurement processes, maintaining financial records, and contracting continued throughout the development and application of the application.
Okay, so there was no sort of alignment between the key departments and no clear overarching blueprint or a plan from the beginning. There's been a lot of talk about the situation, this being in the pandemic, and that has played a role in how government did a lot of its spending. But from what you've seen, do the problems with the ArriveCan app, were they typical for what government was doing at the time, or were they exceptional even under those circumstances?
So I do want to acknowledge that this was happening at a time that was confusing and uncertain for so many, that if you put yourself back into March and April of 2020, it's sometimes hard to do. But the public service was asked to respond quickly and act swiftly to support Canadians. And at the time, the Secretary of the Treasury Board gave the public service that flexibility and said, in order to act quickly, don't worry about all of the rules or all of the hoops that you would normally jump through when you have to issue contracts, for example. But it was very clear that the public service was expected to continue to document that they made decisions with due regard for the use of public funds and that they could be answerable for the decisions they made, and that was missing. So an emergency is not a reason to throw all the rules out of the window.
Okay, I want to get to a little bit more on the accountability stuff in just a second, but first I want to talk about the price. I mean, when this was initially announced, I believe the Prime Minister said that the initial cost for this app would be around $80,000. Now, you're not going to get cloud management and call centers and all of the levels of support for this sort of thing for $80,000, but you've got it at $59.5 million, potentially higher. What would have been a reasonable price for a project like this, for an app with all of the other requirements to make it work?
So that's a difficult question to answer. You could probably do that here with hindsight and look back and say, gee, this would have been really simple. But you have to remember that there were so many different changes to the rules and expectations at the border. So imagine at the beginning, it was just about having a quarantine plan. Then it became providing proof that you had been vaccinated. Then it was testing before you arrived, when you arrived, after you arrived. So all of those changes made matters more complicated. At the beginning, this was about digitizing a form to help speed up the collection of information at the border, but it really became so much more when you think about protecting people's private information, when you think about bilingualism, the security that's needed around such an app, and the linkages with other apps that were out there. So it's hard to put a price tag, but it's clear that the financial records were not properly maintained, and it's difficult to know the exact cost of the ArriveCan application.
Okay, so we have a price tag that is, high, and it's unclear exactly why it ended up going there. Because as you point out, Auditor General, the IT staffing firm GT Strategies, which was at the center of this and which is under some scrutiny right now, it was involved in drafting contracts that it was able to get. Is this situation so difficult because of GC Strategies, because it was picked and given so much control over the process? Is the outside consultant so central to these problems?
So what we found was that there was a prolonged dependency on third-party contractors, not just on GC Strategies, and that prolonged dependency really increased the dollar value paid for the application, which is one of the reasons why we concluded that the public service didn't get the best value for money for Canadians when it came to this application. Now, the matter you're raising about GC Strategies being involved in setting some of the requirements for a competitive contract should not have happened. The Canada Border Service Agency gave an advantage to a vendor that other vendors did not have. And that shouldn't happen. And our recommendation was clear that they should ensure it doesn't happen again. But this just speaks to why it's important for public service to document well the decisions they make and the judgment calls they make. So if ever there is someone who wants to question, was this prudent or the right decision, that there's something there to support the actions that were taken.
So you said they were dependent on the outside consultants. You've also talked about how these outside consultants were inviting civil servants to dinner. The Globe and Mail has reported that some civil servants may have improperly taken part in an online whiskey tasting event. I know you didn't investigate these because these are already being looked into by, say, the RCMP and others. But I wonder, Ms. Hogan, were the RCMP not looking into this already? Would you have referred these matters to the RCMP for further investigation? Is this the sort of thing that your office would have flagged as a possible significant violation of the way the civil service is supposed to operate?
So I think there's two things at play here. One is about the code of conduct and respecting the Canada Border Services Agency's code of conduct. And that's the internal investigation that's ongoing by the agency. And we didn't want to double up on our efforts. We're going to be watching that really closely to see what the outcomes are of that investigation. And the second matter is whether or not something was of a criminal nature here. Well, the expert in deciding that is really the RCMP. It is not my audit office. Would we have referred things? In a normal situation, we would have done our audit, and if we uncovered things that we thought were questionable or suspicious of a potential criminal behavior, we would have referred things. But in this case, the RCMP had already begun or had already been referred a matter around contracting practices. So I spoke to them. And while I do not know if their investigation is started or ongoing or where they will take it, I did tell them that once our report was made public, which happened today, if they would like access to our file and the evidence that we have, they could formally request it and we would provide it to them.
Okay, so because of those limitations, you didn't look into these matters, perhaps to the degree that you would have had these other processes not been going on. Am I understanding that correctly? And that's why you haven't found anything necessarily that would have warranted a code of conduct investigation or a police investigation?
Absolutely. We didn't want to compromise the ongoing internal investigation nor get in the way of a potential investigation by the RCMP. But we will keep a close eye on that internal one to see where that ends up. And we can always decide that we would like to do more work if we're not satisfied with where that went or the responses that come out of that internal investigation.
What was the government's role in oversight here, Ms. Hogan, in terms of, I know this was a CBSA app, but was procurement involved in, approving the increases and the extra contracts? Would Treasury Board, Privy Council, the PMO, any of the other departments have noticed this or been consulted on this or been asked for approval as this work just grew and grew and grew and the costs kept increasing?
So I would take you back to probably two of our findings. And if we go back to 2020, at the start, as I mentioned, the Secretary of the Treasury Board gave the entire public servants a lot of flexibility in order to act quickly. But in this case, there was a lot of different orders that came out of the Emergency Act about measures at the border. And all of those drove sort of the changes and the need to have the ArriveCan application update it. So I would have expected that there would have been a good file maintained on how there was briefings or involvement of senior officials. We really focus in on, once the government has given direction to the public service, what does the public service do with that? And as I mentioned, there was no governance structure put in place. And so oversight was really lacking or thin, and very little was documented around that. And that shouldn't happen. Most of these contracts were small. I would have imagined they were treated like contracts in the normal course of operations. But you needed better oversight and really the fundamentals of what should be in a contract, like clear deliverables and the skills and competencies of workers. Those were missing in many of the documents that we looked at.
So just this is a final point, who should have been providing that oversight? We know there are two civil servants now who are suspended without pay pending an investigation, and I know that's outside of the purview of your work. Are these the people who should have been providing that oversight? Should have been political oversight, or are there other people in the system? I know the president of the CBSA has retired. Who should have been providing that oversight that you say was missing?
So it's a bit of a complicated answer. I would have expected at the beginning that the Public Health Agency of Canada, because they were responsible for making sure that the measures at the border were properly implemented, that they would have had a lot of oversight over this. But they had asked the Canada Border Services Agency to help them develop the app and to implement it. So, as I said, the lack of clarity over who was supposed to be the accountable party was part of the confusion here. Ultimately, I would expect that the deputy head of any organization would be answerable for decisions made by the organization. But I would also expect that management, so looking at assistant deputy ministers, director generals, and directors, to set the tone about really following the procurement guidelines and policies and good project management practices. And we didn't see evidence of that happening at many levels. And so, it's ultimately the deputy head, but I think there are many levels that could have and should have done better.
So this is a total systemic failure. Nobody was really in charge. Nobody really laid out a plan, and nobody really was minding the store as it moved through the steps. I mean, have you ever seen anything like this in your years as an Auditor General?
So I've looked at many contracts throughout the pandemic, and while we always find few opportunities for improvement, in here it is a bit of a head scratcher about the glaring disregard for some of the most basic rules when it comes to financial management, contracting, and just project management in general.
Auditor General Karen Hogan, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Well, not surprisingly, opposition leaders pounced on the Liberals for their role in this ArriveCan controversy.
If he wants to hold someone to account for the Arrive scam, why not hold the one person who had the authority to create the Arrive scam and who had the authority to stop the Arrive scam, and that's the Prime Minister of Canada.
Well, let's talk about the garbage decisions of this Liberal government. The Auditor General found that the Liberals wasted $60 million on an app, the ArriveCan app, that no one uses and doesn't work, all at a time when Canadians are struggling with their groceries and their rent.
I'm joined now by Charles Sousa. He's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you for coming in today, sir.
Thank you, David.
You heard Jagmeet Singh call this a garbage decision by your government. You heard the Auditor General call it a head scratcher. What's your reaction to this report?
Listen, we appreciate the Auditor General's report. We appreciate the work that's being done internally and the work that we've been doing throughout committees over the last number of months. We have concerns, and we are just as angry as anyone in terms of the processes that were not taken, that are appropriate in a procurement process. We also recognize that during the urgency of the pandemic and so much was happening and so much directives were taken to try to protect the border and the crossing of the border and the trade and all the other elements that come with that. But no, we welcome the recommendations. They've been implemented, most of them, and they're still ongoing.
The pandemic has been used as sort of an explanation or an excuse for this, depending on how you want to describe it. But the Auditor General made pretty clear there are basic things that just didn't get done here. This isn't like CERB, where it had to be rushed out the door, and there was an expectation that some people would sign up for it who didn't qualify for it and didn't need it. This is the government's own people in two big departments not doing their job.
And that's why we also have addressed this with the RCMP, and we took those extra steps. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there is no excuse for when things falter. We recognize that there was a lot of demands being placed upon the bureaucrats in order to get things done. But no, we've actually taken extra steps with the accountability measures. Recognize too, there's over 10,000 contracts that are done by the government. So this component that was done in expeditiously were the ones that we're addressing. And there's a lot of misunderstanding as to how much was actually spent. So that is a concern to us, for sure.
Well, we don't know how much was actually spent, right? I know the initial price tag was $80,000. Now, I know that's the development phase. And to have cloud servicing and protection of privacy was going to grow from there. But what is your sense, as someone who's on the committee studying this and as a parliamentary secretary to the procurement minister, what this should have cost as opposed to what it may have cost?
That's an excellent question. And when we look at it, what would it cost had we not done it, is even worse. It was billions of dollars at stake. And of course, there was some paper transactions and other things that were being used that would never have been able to accommodate the need that was relevant for both health issues and cross-border trade issues. The Auditor General also recognizes that it was about $12 million, and really, there's misunderstanding. Are those really ArriveCan or not? So there's questionable issues. And the reason she's questioning it and suggesting, well, let's going to put all in ArriveCan, is because you can't distinguish between those that are ongoing elements beyond ArriveCan, like the $6 million that's been issued for immigration and an additional $6 million for other activities beyond ArriveCan. But the application and the work that was done for ArriveCan were essential, obviously, for the protection of individuals and the trade and the cross-border.
Well, 10,000 people were improperly quarantined. There is this controversy around consultants who were involved in awarding themselves essentially contracts by setting the terms of the contracting and then inviting the people they were doing the contracts with to whiskey tastings and dinners which were not disclosed. I mean, I appreciate that it's essential to have greater regulation of the border. But when the people making these decisions in the department are going to dinner and getting liquor from the people they're doing business with, like, that is not essential in any way.
So, David, we had those discussions around the committee work as well. Yeah. I mean, we asked the witnesses directly in terms of were they being conflicted? Were their activities engaged that was providing preferential treatment to certain contractors? Remember now, the process of contracting and subcontracting in procurement is evident throughout industries, throughout governments, throughout the previous Conservative government. In fact, the same player who we're talking about from GC Strategy, the same individual, was one of the major players from the Conservative government days as well. But that doesn't excuse the activity that took place. What is important, the Auditor General made clear, is that no one got paid for work not done. Like, that's clear. The Ombudsman made that very clear as well.
Well, there was a question of whether they did as much of the work as they should have. There are still questions on the remittances there.
But the alternative was that there was no one to do the job. That was the issue. We didn't have the resources or the skill set within government to proceed to do the ArriveCan application that was needed at the time, and she recognized that as well.
Okay, I get that you may not have app developers and people like that in government, but you do have administrators who are supposed to administrate contracts and have backgrounds of that, and this is where the failing is. She's not necessarily criticizing the IT work, it's the paperwork and the processes.
We totally acknowledge that, and we've recognized that. That's why we've taken the steps internally to correct them. And she's appropriate. Those appropriate issues that was revealed, and we accept that.
So you were a Minister of Finance in the Ontario government. If you got a report like this on your department operating like this is two big agencies, right? The Public Health Agency of Canada, who sort of pushed it onto the CBSA to deal with. The Auditor General said she thought PHAC would have dealt with it. Turns out it was CBSA, but nobody really took control. Nobody set a budget. Nobody set a plan. I mean, what would you do to your department as a minister if you saw this sort of an outcome?
Well, the ministers in both departments are very acute to the issue, and they're taking appropriate actions to correct them. Certainly, accountability is a big part of this. We want to make certain that those that are doing the work are held accountable and accordingly. And if there's allegations of misconduct, then those have to be corrected and dealt with appropriately as well. And those are things that are being taken. That's what's being done.
So there are two civil servants who are suspended without pay. They are central players in ArriveCan, but also allegations of other issues with another contract involving CBSA from their time there. But the Auditor General made the point that there's multiple levels here of accountability and oversight and responsibility for what happened here. What's the political responsibility from the elected arm of government to have something like this happen? I know she doesn't, it seems to be within CBSA, it seems to be within civil service from these findings, but ministers are ultimately responsible for what's happening in their agencies.
The government took initiatives and put directives in place to deal with the pandemic at the time, It was told that we needed to get these things expedited more quickly, and as a result, certain measures weren't taken. And so the responsibility of government is to ensure that measures are properly taken. That wasn't done. But we did get results in terms of getting CERB and CEBA, protections for Canadians, protections for those with jobs. Businesses were still running, trade was initiating, people were being cared for, while a few and many were detained. So many more millions of Canadians were using the app to enable them to cross and be protected. And remember, without the app, we probably wouldn't have been able to address certain other countries that were also doing trade and accessing us. So government has a responsibility to ensure that people are cared for, that trade is taken care of, that people are moving, that people are healthy. Those steps were taken, and those businesses and individuals that were at risk were protected. Notwithstanding the fact that the opposition opposed them, we took those measures.
But the government's also responsible for managing the money of the country, managing the finances and making sure contracts are awarded properly. We have 2 civil servants suspended without pay while they're being investigated. Based on what you've seen, based on what you've heard from the Auditor General, do you think there's a possibility that people should lose their jobs over this?
That'll be up to the agencies. It'll be up to the investigations by the RCMP and the internal investigation that's being done by CBSA. So I'll leave them to do the work. I don't want to prejudice those outcomes. But absolutely, you have to be held accountable to your actions. We have to make sure that no one breaks the law.
So this report is out. This is public. It's been called damning. It's been called scathing. People are running out of adjectives to describe the findings of Karen Hogan here. But there's another report the public hasn't seen. The CBSA report that was given to the committee that you sit on, the Government Operations Committee last week, that led to the suspension of hearings because of the potential implications of what is in that report, and which Mr. Johari, your colleague, referred to as scary. I'm assuming you've had that report, you've read that report. I know it's confidential, so you're not going to tell me what's in that report, but I'm wondering if you can help us understand what makes that report so scary compared to what we've seen from the Auditor General today. Is it even worse than what we saw today?
Well, actually, what's really scary is the fact that that statement of facts that was provided to the committee, to the chair and to the clerk, week prior to Mr. Lafleur, who's the investigator, came before the committee. What's very scary is the fact that the opposition had a copy of that report. What's really scary is that it was told that it was confidential, you shouldn't be sharing it, and they were creating questions and illustrating to the investigator what was in the report, so obstructing his work. That's the reason this took a pause, is because people were misappropriating and misusing information at hand that was used confidentially, and certainly the president of CBSA cautioned us to do this in camera, which wasn't done. And those are the parts that prejudice the outcome. You know, witnesses were being approached by the opposition when there's an investigation underway. So those are the kind of things that have to be, and so things in that report, we need to provide integrity. And the integrity is best kept when we allow them to do their investigation and do their work. By prejudicing or by doing a lynching at the time of this situation, that's incorrect. We have to pause that.
Look, I understand you want to protect the integrity of the process and the investigation, so no outcomes are undermined. But your colleague has called it scary. How would you describe what's in that report? How worried should Canadians be about what was found by the CBSA in this internal investigation of things?
I think that the work and the investigations that have taken place, the work that's done by the Ombudsman and the Auditor General today, will lead us to a better outcome. I would say what's found in the statement of facts is conduct that needs to ensure it may be seen as unbecoming, and we have to make certain that doesn't continue.
Charles Sousa, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thanks for coming in today.
Thanks, Dave.
Appreciate it.